الرابع من تشرين الثاني نوفمبر عام 79 في طهران، آراء غربية متضاربة وتشويه للوقائع. قصة السيطرة على السفارة الأمريكية في طهران من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا.
Actions of Iran have shocked the civilized world.
هي أول امرأة تنضم إلى حكومة في الجمهورية الإسلامية في إيران. هي نيلوفر ابتكار المعروفة بمعصومة ابتكار، أو حتى بماري المتحدثة باسم الطلاب الإيرانيين خلال أزمة الرهائن في السفارة الأمريكية عام 79، وقد وثقت هذه المرحلة في كتاب نشر في كندا. ابتكار المتخصصة في البيئة وحقوق المرأة، متأثرة بكتابات المفكر الإيراني علي شريعتي، حائزة شهادة الليسانس في التقنية الطبية من جامعة الشهيد بهشتي، وشهادة الماجستير والدكتوراه في المناعة الطبية من جامعة إعداد المدرسين، حيث أصبحت أستاذة في الجامعة نفسها. الرئيس الأسبق السيد محمد خاتمي عين ابتكار نائبة له ورئيسة لمنظمة حماية البيئة لمدة 8 أعوام إبان عهده بين 97 و2005، قبل أن تنتخب عضوة في مجلس بلدية طهران حتى حزيران 2013، كما ترأست تحرير صحيفة كيهان الإنكليزية لعامين. ها هي ابتكار تعود إلى مركزها السابق بعدما عينها رئيس الجمهورية الإسلامية الشيخ حسن روحاني في أيلول سبتمبر الماضي نائبة له ومكلفة شؤون البيئة. ابتكار الحائزة عدة جوائز تقدير، كيف تصف مرحلة السيطرة على السفارة الأمريكية بعد انتصار الثورة الإسلامية في إيران، ونشاطها ودورها آنذاك، والمساعي الحثيثة لقلب الوقائع وأهداف ذلك، وكيف ترى التحديات التي تواجه العالم الإسلامي اليوم. Dr. معصومة ابتكار, Iran's former Vice President and current member of Tehran City Council, welcome to the Inside.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, ma'am. Back on November 4th, 1979, you were part and parcel of a very important incident. What can you tell us about معصومة ابتكار back then, and what was your role?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In those days, I was part of a young generation that was very hopeful for a wave of change and transformation, a revolution in Iran that would bring about improvements in terms of political, social, and economic status of our society. We looked forward for a revolution. We were part of a revolution in the making. And we were very young, energetic. We had very lofty aspirations. We had a very strong faith in a version of Islam that was very progressive, forward-looking, and at the same time based on the dignity of humankind. And on this basis, we were a generation that we felt that we had to take action, an action to change the situation, particularly when we felt that there's an imminent threat on behalf of foreign powers to intervene in our country. We had the history of 1953. We had an American-instigated coup d'etat in Iran.
Yes.
And so that history, that very dark part of history, always somehow influenced our mentality.
It cast its shadows.
Exactly.
On
it cast its shadow
young generation.
On the young generation. And particularly, we were university students. We were involved in all these political debates about the history of Iran. Why do we have such a long dictatorship in Iran, tyranny, and how can we change that? So these were major questions that took us to take the initiative, both in the revolution and the issue of the American embassy after the Shah was admitted to Iran. And so we were part of this movement. We were all members and part of this movement.
What was your specific role back then?
My specific
And why
role
were
was-
you dubbed as Mary by the U.S.
Because
press?
I had been educated. My father was a PhD student in the United States. I had been educated in the U.S. I had studied there, so my English was fluent at that time, particularly compared to other students. I could speak fairly well and express myself. And so the students invited me after, about 2 or 3 days after the takeover, they invited me to join them because they felt that they needed someone to convey to help them to convey their message. So I was invited to take part with them, and I joined them. And the first time that a reporter, a journalist, asked me what my name was and who I was, I decided to give a pen name.
A nickname.
A nickname,
Yes.
a pen name, like. And so I thought that Mary or Maryam,
Yes.
the mother of Jesus, who is a personality common to both Muslims and Christians alike, could stand as a meaningful name for a woman who is involved in such
That's what was referred to you
issue.
back then as...
Exactly. And so they always called me as Sister Mary or Mary.
Yes. How can you describe that day in particular, the events that took place, that led to what it led?
Well, the events were, I think that the students, they felt very strongly that they have to take a decisive action at this point of history, or else, again, Iran might fall back, the Islamic Revolution might fall back in a long period of tyranny and dictatorship, and the Americans would take the opportunity to again instigate a coup d'etat or change the situation to their benefits, to meet their interests. They felt that they need to take action. So they stood for this. And I think that this was a decision considering those circumstances, because the students were intellectuals. They weren't a violent group of militants as the Americans tried to
As they
depict
were,
them.
you know,
No.
pictured by the press.
They were intellectuals. They were well aware of the situation. They knew that this would be a breach of international law, but they felt that the breach of international law had occurred before in 1953, when the Americans,
coup d'etat.
exactly, when the Americans had instigated a coup d'etat, and during the long years where they had intervened in Iranians' internal affairs, and they had coerced at times the Shah's government to take action on their behalf, to take policies to the detriment of the Iranian people, but to the interests of the American government. These were instances where international law had been breached before. So the students wanted to correct that issue and to make sure that Iran would stand as an independent country. It would be able to realize the aspirations of the people, the aspirations of the Islamic Revolution. We tried from the beginning to establish a dialogue, to speak with the Americans, to speak with the American people, with the international community, why we had taken such an action, why we felt that there was no other way to change the course of events, why we felt that otherwise we would have been doomed, just like we were doomed in 1953, to face a very tragic event in Iran. And we felt that we had to change that course of events by taking such a decisive action.
Yes. In fact, you tried to put all these events, all those events back then, into a book, and you have written your account of the embassy takeover with Fred Reed, which is entitled Takeover in Tehran, the Inside Story of the 1979 U.S. Embassy capture. Why did you decide to put all this in a book, and what can you tell us about some events as an insider?
And the book was translated both in Farsi
and into Arabic
and
too.
also in Arabic, As-Sura for Tehran.
Yes.
And the reason was that I felt that there is a dialogue that needs to be established. The whole event was so abused, in a term we can say, or censored, and it was presented in a very, very...
It was distorted.
It was distorted. It was presented in a very unreal and untrue manner to the international community, to the media. The reality behind why the students had taken such an action, who the students were, what their incentives were, what aspirations they had. This reality was never told at that time. They tried to hide this reality from the American people. They tried to hide the reality from the world opinion. And I tried to make it clear that we were a group of students, we were human beings, we were not after violent means and methods and ways. We were trying to get the message of the Iranian people. We were standing for a nation who just wanted to stand on its own feet as an independent nation. I tried to get that message through. I tried to get the human side of the story, the dialogue that we tried to establish, the 50 American guests that we had. We invited from different walks of life from the American society. We invited 50 Americans to come to Iran. We invited revolutionary groups from throughout the world who were fighting against imperialism. We invited them to come to Iran. We had an international conference for them. We tried in different instances to establish that human dialogue, that human understanding in spite of all those difficult issues that we had between them. For example, women and the Afro-Americans were freed at the very early weeks after the takeover. One of the hostages, his mother came to meet him, and we went through all the difficulties that it had to arrange a meeting.
But nobody knows about that. Too bad.
We tried
Yes.
to, I tried, at least in the book, to
What was the
explain what had
American
happened.
reaction to your book?
The Americans did, no American publisher was granted permission to publish the book. They couldn't publish the book in America, in the United States.
Freedom of expression.
Freedom of expression. Although I used a literary agent, and she took the trouble to send the book to over 50 major publishers in the U.S. And the publishers, initially they welcomed the book. They thought, many of them thought it would be a bestseller, because it was speaking on behalf of for the first time, on behalf of the Iranians. We have so many different books about the event in English from the American side, but this was from a different side, so from a different perspective. And but no American publisher was allowed to publish the book. It was very clear, because initially they would welcome the book, but then at the later stage they would decline. So a Canadian publisher, Talon Books.
Allow us to stop now for a short break, and then when we come back we'll talk a bit more on issues pertaining to November 4th, 1979. A short break and we'll be back. Stay tuned.
نائبة الرئيس الإيراني ومسؤولة لجنة البيئة الدكتور معصومة ابتكار كيف تصف الدور الأمريكي قبل الأحداث التي جرت في 4 نوفمبر تشرين الثاني عام 79 في إيران، وعلى ما ارتكزت الادعاءات التي تروج أن التعذيب مارسه من احتل السفارة الأمريكية آنذاك، وماذا عن التقارير الإعلامية التي رافقت الأحداث وعن حملات تشويه ما جرى بالفعل.
Well, the reality is that the Americans felt that after the coup d'etat in 1953, they felt that they could influence the Shah and his government to promote American interests and American policy in the region. And the Shah's government was called the gendarme of the region. And he was there to promote stability and to improve relations between Muslims and Arab countries, with Israel and with other American allies in the region. He had a very clear role in terms of securing American interests in the Persian Gulf, securing the flow of oil and energy from this region. And well, we had about 60 or 70,000 American forces in Iran. The Iranian society was severely suppressed in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of basic social freedoms. There were what we could call cultural freedoms, to the extent that the Western culture was promoted as a viable form of livelihood. But more than that, political freedoms were totally suppressed in Iran, and political activists had a very difficult time. Many of them were imprisoned, many of them were tortured, particularly if they had a religious background, particularly those with a revolutionary Islamic profile or ideology. They faced very difficult times. And the general approach on religion was that religion is a very backward entity. It should be set aside. We should take a modern approach on the world, and in that case Iran could be a model of modernity and an advanced civilization if it put
in the region,
religion and Islam away, and if it took a westernized approach, it would be a cradle of civilization.
Now, allow me to go back to the incidents back then, that there were certain claims of torture taking place, and you said that nothing happened and whatever, but what were those claims based on? That there were certain kind of torture of the hostages?
There was no kind. The torture that the hostages talked about was totally a fantasy. It was very clear. They were all very healthy when they were released.
After 444 days.
Exactly.
Yes.
The students had no reason to torture anyone. But, for example, they faced difficult times because they were detained. They were in confinement, but they had very comfortable rooms. They had very good quality of food, better than us, better than the students. They had time for rest, time for play, time for exercise, taking a bath, and well.
But Dr. Ibtikar, don't you think that what took place back then by the students has, to a certain extent, damaged the standing of Iran?
I don't think it has damaged the standing of Iran, because I think that
or affected it negatively.
I think that the main reason why it may have had a negative effect is that it was not depicted properly. It was distorted by particularly American media. The message, the true actions, the true incentives behind this event was not properly portrayed for the American people, for the international media. This was an act of defense. It was an act of, I think, defiance of foreign intervention in Iran. The Iranian people stood up in face of an imperialist power, and I think that the message was very clear. And this was inspirational for many other nations as well, I feel, because they also felt that they could stand up on the basis of their own faith, on the basis of their own dignity, and they could stand up and...
Now, not only the media reports, as you were saying, that they were distorted by the wrong images and ideas coming out of the incident, but also in Hollywood, they put forth a movie and movies actually that try to indoctrinate you know, certain kind of stereotypes and images, and particularly the one related to the incident of the takeover of the American embassy, which is Argo. And, you know, even the Canadian, one of the Canadian former diplomats, he said that, well, whatever was put forth is not what really happened. Actually, he said that they wanted to discredit the Canadian part and put all the credit, give all the credit to the CIA back then.
The takeover of the American embassy was a very frustrating event for the American government. And they tried to make up for that historical frustration by making a movie through Hollywood, which was very politicized, very low quality in terms of the standards that even Hollywood stands for, but depicting the positive aspect for the American public, a victory for the American public. The fact that 6 or 7 American diplomats were taken out of the country and freed on the basis of fake Canadian passports. This was a small victory for the Americans, alongside the defeat that they faced at the hands of a nation. And I think that was the major reason why they went ahead to create Argo. Argo does not portray the reality.
However, it got most of the Academy Awards.
It got many awards. It was very politicized because even Michelle Obama came to the, she didn't come there, she took part. She said through a video conference, she gave the award, she announced the award. So it's very clear. And the way that they portrayed the Iranian people, they could have used the original footage, they didn't. They could have...
Perhaps, ma'am, this is one of the prime challenges that the region is witnessing now. And I want you here to highlight a bit what is also one of the most prominent challenges that the Islamic world is facing nowadays.
The Islamic world has been now grasping with dictatorial regimes, what we call maybe the Arabic Spring or the Islamic Awakening, and they have been trying to express their identity, express their and stand on the basis of their dignity. But I think that there are many reasons why foreign powers would not go along with this line, because many of those dictatorial regimes were in line with the interests of the American government. They were in line with the interests of the Zionist regime. And now things have changed course. I think that the major policy that the enemies of these nations, Islamic nations, are trying to pursue is to instigate ethnic and religious strife among Muslim communities, to engulf these nations in a sectarian divide between the Shia and the Sunnis, between the different sects, the different ethnic groups that exist within this large Islamic ummah. And this is the danger. This is the very, very serious threat that we're facing today.
Right. Allow me here to ask you one last question pertaining to something very important that you are part and parcel of. You were named as one of the 50 environmental leaders by the Guardian newspaper on January 5th, 2008, the only Iranian and Muslim woman to be named in that list. What can you tell us about your expertise and about your major achievements in the field of environment?
For 8 years, I was the Vice President and the head of the Department of the Environment. And I tried, along with a very strong group of experts and advisors in the field of the environment, and also NGOs, civil society. We try to promote the environmental agenda in Iran. Iran is a country facing a very diverse environment, a very fragile ecological condition in Iran. We have a great diversity of flora and fauna, but we also have many, many challenges. We have, in some times, low rainfall. We have large industrial areas. Urbanization is taking its toll. But we started a campaign from the Department of the Environment and moving on towards civil society to bring about a change in the perspective of the Iranians on the environment, to mobilize our resources to protect the environment of our country. And I think that this campaign, this movement in general, was quite successful because it coincided with the reform movement in Iran. The reform movement based on the leadership, the presidency of President Khatami, was to promote change and to go back on the issues, challenges that we had from the beginning of the revolution, to promote reform on those issues. One of the important issues that we faced was the fact that we needed a sustainable agenda for our development processes. The sustainability issue was the major factor that we tried to promote. And I was also awarded the Champion of the Earth Award by the United Nations in 2006. And that was also due to this campaign that the people also supported, the civil society supported, the media supported throughout the country.
Yes, yes. Dr. معصومة ابتكار, Iran's former vice president and member of the Tehran City Council. Many thanks indeed for this interview from your office here in Tehran. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. إذا theinside@almayadeen.net. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل الذي رافقني في إيران، لكم جزيل الشكر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.